Welcome to the Corpus Christi YouTube page. My name is Deacon Richard Conlon, and it's my pleasure to be joined by Father Bryan Duggan.
Good to be here. Thank you.
I am a priest in training. Sometimes they joke that I'm a PIT, a priest in training. And I'm joined with Father Bryan Duggan, who's a doctor in training, a DIT.
That's the first time I've been called that.
Well, it's great to be with him. And Father Bryan has just finished, is it 4 or 5 years?
I finished 4, one more to go.
Yeah, so from the Institute of Psychological Sciences in Virginia, Father Bryan is undergoing his doctorate in psychology. And just to start out, just wondering what got you interested in psychology in the first place?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, it was an unexpected kind of turn, in my priestly vocation. I was ordained in 2011, and after a couple of years, was asked to be involved in vocations, which you and I connected back in 2013, I think it was, first. And in that work, in vocations ministry and working with seminarians, got to know a counselor in our diocese, whom you know well, who does a lot of work with seminarians and young adults, and outside of kind of traditional therapies, more kind of talks a lot about human formation and about that kind of foundation that utilizes some of the wisdom of psychology. And so that was my first real kind of exposure to psychology, and I was really impressed with him, with the work that he was doing, and with that kind of integration of psychology and a solid faith. So that was my first exposure, and I was intrigued by it. I was impressed with what he was doing, and desired to kind of know more and learn more. But it was not sort of expected that I would have this opportunity to study at all. A lot of my classmates have gone for studies. I was kind of expecting to go for an ecclesiastical degree in Rome, and the Archbishop asked me to consider psychology. Kind of identified a need in the diocese for some expertise in this area, particularly for work with seminarians and with priests and religious. But just more broadly, to have that kind of knowledge from a trusted source, because the field can be hard, sometimes to navigate those waters. So it was the Archbishop who invited me to consider getting a master's in psychology, and so I did a little bit of research. He had said that it would probably be best to stay in North America because. There's sometimes some difficulty, especially with like a counseling degree or a psychologist degree, to get licensed in North America, having studied in Europe, say in Rome or something like that. It can be a little bit difficult. So he had suggested North America, and this school in Virginia was highly recommended by a number of experts that I spoke to. As a very intentional integration of a solid Catholic faith and the science of psychology, and so that was sort of how I stumbled upon the Institute for Psychological Sciences. Now, more broadly, Divine Mercy University is the kind of umbrella name. And then when I came back to the Archbishop, I said, well, see, they have this master's degree, and they also have a 5-year doctorate. And that was also on the pamphlet that I showed him, and he said, well, what about the doctorate? So that was the first, it was very unexpected and daunting, but also, great privilege to have this opportunity. So that's how I ended up here.
Oh, it's so rare to see a place in which the Catholic faith can be integrated with modern psychology, because psychology, as many are aware, it's a potentially hazardous place. I read a book in seminary called Psychology as Religion
Right.
by Paul Vitz, in which they presented psychology in many circles is actually taking over religious practice.
Right.
And so can you just speak about the pitfalls of psychology today, and then maybe how Catholics can actually approach psychology in a healthy way?
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, there's a reason why there's some suspicion and maybe caution around psychology, and for Christians to go to therapy, there can sometimes be some real hesitation around. Can I trust my interior life to somebody who might not be Christian, and even if they are Christian or Christian psychologists, like what does that mean? So there's reason for caution, and Paul Vitz in that book identifies some particularly egregious errors, really, that occurred in the field of psychology, where atheism was kind of assumed. It was sort of a foundation for a lot of psychologists and a lot of theories of psychology, and there was some real harm that occurred where that was kind of imposed upon, whether it was an individual client or a community. He talks about some of these religious communities that got a little bit carried away with a particular psychological theory that actually ended up distancing themselves from their vocation and the relationship with Christ that first kind of called them and was the foundation of their life. So there's definitely some evidence for reasons for caution. It's funny, when I went to Virginia the first time to visit the school, Paul Vitz is the chancellor.
Okay.
Yeah, so he was there, and in fact he was there. He was part of like our little orientation day, just doing a little Q&A. And
did you get him to sign your book? I read your book in seminary.
Actually, I have a funny story about that I could come back to. But I did. I asked him about the book. I said we read this in seminary, and it seems to paint a pretty negative picture for psychology and for psychology for those who are faithful Catholics. And I was like, so what's? And now you're the chancellor of this university that teaches psychology. I was like, how do you tell me about that? Like, what's happened? And it was really interesting. He said he wrote that book in the 70s, and in the 70s, the field of psychology was very, in most places, atheist and almost and aggressively so, and kind of pathologizing the faith. That it was sort of somebody who had the faith was, in many circles, kind of seen as that's some kind of pathology, some kind of defense. There's something underneath that needs to be healed, so that the person will then mature and no longer need to depend on this spirituality. So he was very very concerned about the direction the field was going, and he said, "I haven't changed." He says, "My opinion has not changed. The field of psychology has changed." And he said there's a much greater openness, even in very secular circles, to some kind of spirituality, some kind of belief in the higher power, an awareness of the limitations of psychology in particular. He says that there's an increasing awareness, a humility, he called it, in the field of psychology, that they don't have all the answers. They have a lot. There's a lot that the science can contribute, but they don't have everything. And he's encountered a much greater openness, a much greater humility in the field, and gives him great hope. And so the school is kind of a sign of that hope, of that very competent, secularly licensed psychologists who are conducting research and contributing to the field are also very faithful Christian and Catholic men and women. And so I think we're seeing a lot of signs of hope. Now, it's a broad field, so there's lots of people that might still disagree with that. But he's pointing to a lot of signs of hope.
Yeah, building upon that, what would you say are some of the key benefits that psychology can provide to just the average person coming to church? Like, why should they engage in any psychological practices to help their Catholic faith?
That's a big question. I mean, psychology is such a broad word, too. I mean, it just encompasses so much. So when someone says, should I trust psychology? That's okay. Let's press into that. What do you mean? What's coming up for you in your experience that is provoking that question? So is it a question of well, let's rephrase. What can good psychology contribute to the faith? A great deal. I think a great deal. We talk a lot in seminary and human formation about the importance of self-knowledge. That and there's a really helpful kind of image. Seminarians are preparing themselves for ordination. So I must know myself, I must accept myself, and then come to a place of kind of self-possession where with that knowledge and acceptance of myself, I have gained some interior freedom and a kind of holy detachment that I'm able to to slowly be less kind of grasping in my relationships and more not independent. That's not the right word, but self-possession is that kind of place of freedom that I can be free in myself in relationship with another. And then the particular call of the priesthood is that gift of self to Christ and his church, whether that's diocesan to a particular church or in the religious life, similar to marriage, where in the ideal marital relationship, you have that self-knowledge, self-acceptance, self-possession in order to give yourself to your spouse. And if you don't possess yourself, well, go all the way back. If you don't know yourself, you can't accept yourself. Self-possession is all the more harder because you're a mystery to yourself. And self-gift, even more difficult.
Yeah.
And so I think the great contribution of psychology is I mean, in all four of those stages, but particularly self-knowledge, self-acceptance, and self-possession. That a good psychologist can really help us to get to know that which sort of lies beneath the surface. We all have a consciousness. We all have a range of awareness for ourselves, and we all have blind spots, and we all have a common image used is that iceberg analogy where what you see is just the tip of the iceberg, 10% or so that's above the surface, and there's 90% that's below. So there's a lot going on in our hearts and in our minds that it takes a kind of very slow and patient, acceptant kind of posture and really good listening in order to be able to discover. And I think that psychological principles and a really good psychologist can help us enormously in these areas.
And it's really good. I remember when I was at seminary for the first time hearing that journey from self-knowledge, self-acceptance, self-possession, and then self-gift. Recognizing this real desire in me to be able to make a gift of myself. I want to grow in the ability to love well. And then, okay, now I want to engage in this process. So then it was inspiring for me to want to grow in self-knowledge so that I can make a greater gift of myself. So how do you practically go about increasing self-knowledge without actually going to a psychologist? What is a way for someone to grow in self-knowledge today?
Sure. Yeah, those are good questions. I think, does everyone need to go to therapy? No, of course not. Everyone couldn't go. But I think, there's a lot of resources that are out there for sure. I know a podcast that I found really helpful is Adam Young, and but that's, I mean, it's basically about how to listen to your story. And he has different guests and talks about their stories. He talks a little bit about attachment theory. It's kind of his primary orientation, theoretical orientation. That's part of the challenge in the field of psychology. Is there's such a diversity of theories as well. And so you have some psychologists who are trained in behavioral modalities, and some that are more kind of, they call it dynamic, psychodynamic, which would be looking at the unconscious. And so there's a whole spectrum. And then some kind of have a combination of a few. And so part of it is finding the person that's helpful, right? It's finding the resource that is helpful for you to listen. And so maybe you're more inclined to a kind of cognitive behavioral type way of talking about the unconscious, or not the unconscious, about the mind. And that would be, people talk a lot about the relationship between thoughts and emotions. And so if we can adjust the way that we think about ourselves, that can have an impact on how we feel about ourselves and others and external situations, and have an impact in our behavior. And so there's a lot of focus in that kind of modality on identifying those deeply held convictions about ourselves that are not always in the level of our awareness. So Adam Young, it takes more of the attachment theory approach, which is real close attention to my relationships and how, especially when relationships are stressed or when I'm afraid, what do I notice in myself? What are some of the patterns that I can identify in terms of, do I avoid in a time of stress, and I know that somebody is kind of angry with me, do I avoid them? Is that my primary avoid conflict, or do I really find myself very anxious and like needing to know that I'm okay, and like constantly pursuing the person, and that's kind of a classic example of have a difficult date. It doesn't go so well, and then the person's like texting constantly, like, "Are we okay? I didn't mean to upset you. I'm sorry, I chose the wrong restaurant." So being aware of those patterns. That sometimes we can just do automatically. It's like, so being able to pause, identify them, and then really listen to what's going on beneath the surface. So I guess my encouragement would be that, does everybody need to go to therapy? No, of course not. But we need each other. We need others to be able to speak into our lives. And we need others who have the maturity and the capacity to listen to us well, and help us to listen to ourselves. And we can get some of that from there's so many resources online, podcasts and YouTube videos and whatnot. So finding something like that can be really helpful. But also finding a mature friend is invaluable. A mentor even, or somebody who can kind of journey with us and help us to listen to ourselves and identify these things. I think I'm more and more convinced we can't do it alone. And it's actually very harmful to try and fix ourselves, and it can be so incredibly isolating and just sort of even add to the difficulty.
I remember in seminary just journaling about some of these dynamics that were going on, and trying to be curious with myself, and just asking the question, okay, why did I react in this way? Why was I triggered by this person behaving toward me? And then just the value of being able to bring those journal reflections to other trusted people, and having them just listen to me and ask questions, and just to go deeper, and all with the real overarching insight that growing in self-knowledge will lead to eventual self-acceptance. And then out of self-possession, I can make a gift to myself. So when you begin to experience self-gift, like the ability to love well, then it makes it so much worth it to to actually start to go underneath the tip of the iceberg
Right.
and go there. So
That's so huge. Yeah, there can be this resistance to the kind of self-knowledge, like, and even hear it from good kind of Christian Catholic sources that, well, that inward focus is selfish, and so we're called to go out of ourselves and love others, and it can be, of course, there can be this kind of navel gazing, sort of stuck looking inside, that never orients outside. And so that is a pitfall to be avoided, for sure. But to have that orientation of self-knowledge for the sake of self-gift is huge, right? Because it helps me to realize, no, this is not selfish. This is not a kind of unhealthy, narcissistic inward gaze, but it is for the sake of self-acceptance, self-possession, and ultimately self-gift. And that's such a blessing in seminary to have that opportunity to kind of have that time for reflection, and to have others that we can bring that to and be open to. That is, it's a rare thing, actually. So it's a gift in seminary to have. The other thing you mentioned that struck a chord with me is why did I react this way? Such a great question, right? It's just so. Those are the like, they're like warning light indicators, on your dashboard, right? A check engine light comes on. When I find myself just irrationally angry, why was I so mad about such a small thing? Or why did that interaction, why did I find myself kind of thinking about it over and over and over again afterwards? Those are great opportunities. They're like an indicator light, like a check engine light, right? It's we can do two things with that. We can get mad at ourselves. Why did I overreact? I shouldn't overreact. I got to stop that. Or we can say, that's interesting, and adopt that posture of curiosity. And if there's something to be repented of, to repent, of course, and seek forgiveness where required, but without self-condemnation, with just that curiosity, like, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what's going on there. I wonder what's happening, beneath that tip of the iceberg. And that's the case for struggles with sin as well. I think a lot of us really get stuck with that mindset of, I've fallen into sin. I need to never let that happen again, and kind of getting angry at ourselves. And that's, it's not helpful, and it's actually counterproductive. So it's like, repent what needs to be repented. Go to the Lord. He forgives us of our sins. And then just to have that posture, like, that's really interesting. Why did that happen? I wonder what was going on. What was going on in my heart? What happened that day? And just those questions, that ability to listen to ourselves and then to take it to a trusted friend or mentor. It's huge. It can be so transformative.
Think of that we all have these unwanted behaviors. We all have these things that repeat in our lives that we want to get rid of. And you seem to be shedding light on kind of how we go about addressing those unwanted behaviors in a healthy way. Can you just speak a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, we all do. Absolutely. There's unwanted behaviors that we can struggle with, patterns of sin, and it's so, we're so complex as human beings. It's just we are marvelous, just how the Lord has created us, and it's just so fascinating how individual the way in which the Lord wishes to love us, and we get into trouble when we when we start treating ourselves like a formula a little bit, like our relationship with God even is a little bit of a formula. Like, okay, I need to fix this sin, go to confession and work really hard never to sin again. We kind of get in this cycle, and we're kind of stuck in this way of thinking about this unwanted behavior. And the Lord is so much bigger than that. And he deeply desires to enter into that sacred and private place. I love that image. I forget now. It was Pope Francis who said, to remove our sandals before the sacred presence of the other. He was talking about, really accompanying others and loving others well. And just that humility of the other is sacred. Well, Jesus treats us that way. He is just so patient and loving and kind and deeply desirous of knowing us well. And so these unwanted behaviors, sin, wherever there's sin in them, he's destroyed sin on the cross. And he offers us his forgiveness daily, every moment, even the very moment of sin. So the sin is taken care of. There's a deeper level of what he desires for us, and that is to know him and for him to kind of be, for us to embrace him in the depths of who we are, and to know that as I stand naked before God and am known and seen completely, he loves me. He delights in me and desires to be in relationship with me. He chooses me. That is the journey of a lifetime.
Yeah.
And so I think the more that we can take that posture of curiosity, of listening, of trying to step outside of that shame cycle of self-condemnation and getting really upset when we encounter unwanted behavior, the more we can start to see ourselves with the eyes that God sees us, the more we can start to experience him.
So often we come to the sacrament of confession and we have a repeated list of sins that we have. Yeah. And can you just shed light a little bit on how Jesus wants to do much more than just forgive us of our sins in confession?
Yeah, I think, one of the great gifts of the sacrament of confession is precisely that experience of our smallness, our weakness in God's love. And so, yes, absolutely, those sins that we bring to him are forgiven, and he makes that sacramentally present in reconciliation. And then there's also there's this kind of slow. A priest pointed out to me the other day that sacrament, the sacrament of reconciliation, and the sacrament of the Eucharist are the two kind of routine, repeating sacraments, precisely because they, over time, kind of unfold and are meant to sort of blossom in our lives, to allow this grace to kind of penetrate and bear fruit in our lives. And so to see confession or the sacrament of reconciliation as much more than like a car wash where we're just going to get the grime wiped off, and similar to communion as precisely that, communion, an experience of this being seen by God, acknowledging, naming our struggles, our weakness, and being loved by him. And that Jesus desires, so much more than the car wash experience. He desires for us to know at a very deep level the love that he has for us. I think, the term grace can even be a little bit confusing in that, right? That we can separate grace from God as like, I need to be back in a state of sacramental grace, sanctifying grace, and just how that can be talked about as separate from God, when in fact grace is is God. It is relationship with Him, and so to experience the grace of the sacrament of reconciliation is to be drawn deeper into that communion with God, to be, again, just accepted as we are, known as we are, loved as we are, and sent forth as we are. That in my weakness, brokenness, He loves me and He chooses me, and He has a mission, a vocation for me.
Yeah.
That He's with me in.
I like I've often used that car wash analogy, but it's like going deeper is like that Jesus wants to be in the car with you. He wants to do life with you. He doesn't just want to forgive you your sins, but He wants to be in deep communion with you, and out of that comes healing.
Yeah.
And so I think just an encouragement of when you go to confession and you realize that there's these repeated sins, just being able to bring those to the Lord in a conversation and try to seek a deeper place of healing, to ask Him to go beyond just the forgiveness of sins and actually work a miracle of grace in your life.
Right.
Because that's what He wants to do. He wants to go deeper.
Right. Always. Yeah. Always, yeah. Never intrusively. Right. And so I'm conscious that there can also be this sort of sense of pressure of like, I don't have that, I'm not there yet, so I need to get there. And we can almost like turn this work of communion with God into a project that we're failing at. And Jesus is just not like that. That is not His voice. He's just so patient. We are on time. A Christian author, I appreciate, says that all the time. Like, you are on time. You're not late. This idea of pressure, of I need to be. This is so prominent in the seminary, right? It's like this idea of like, I need to be at a certain level before I'm ready to move on. It's like, oh gosh, that's not how God looks at us. Right? We are on time. He desires to walk with us at a leisurely pace, to kind of enter into our story with such kindness and calmness. He's not hurried, He's not rushed, He's not pressured. We can kind of slowly sort of, it's this over time, this opening up and experiencing Him more deeply.
I picture Him in the backseat of the car, just kicking back, relaxing, just in no rush.
Right.
Just good to be with us.
Right.
And He just enjoys being with us.
Right. Just delights in us. I love that it's such a simple phrase, but you said earlier, to do life together. Jesus just desires to do life together. I mean, it's just so true and so easily forgotten, so easily overlooked, right? That somehow God is not interested in the mundane details of my life, or that in my weakness and my sinfulness, I'm apart from Him. He's over here, I'm dealing with my mess, and I just need to get past this so that we can be together. And He's there. He is there in the most mundane, and even that which can seem like so distant from Him.
Depression and anxiety are so prevalent in our culture today.
Yeah.
What would be some of the things that you've learned from your studies to help deal with this in a healthy way?
Yeah, sure. It's very true that there's a noticeable increase in the prevalence of both depression and anxiety. Some of that, there's a lot of research out there. Some of that is probably because we talk about it more. So there likely was a lot of undiagnosed or unacknowledged depression and anxiety, and I think still is. But it's become more acceptable to acknowledge it, and even more, we think about it more. That like, okay, that's something that I might be struggling with. Maybe I should talk to somebody. So I think there's a lot of good actually that we're seeing an increase is not necessarily bad, because it means more people are acknowledging that, oh, this is a struggle for me, and it's okay to acknowledge that, and maybe even seek some help. So that I think is part of it. Then there's lots of theories out there also, about our culture and just the present realities of the world that can contribute to both anxiety and depression. There's so much that could be said. It's hard to cover thoroughly. I think just a few thoughts on that. One, I was talking to somebody recently, and I just need to emphasize this again. Of depression is not a sin. It is not a failure in faith. It's not a failure in faith. And similarly, anxiety, that we can, sometimes even in the writings of the saints and the way in which we kind of read some of these writings, sometimes the way that they're presented, it can create this sense that somehow I've failed. I'm not a good Christian because I'm struggling with depression, or I don't trust in God enough because I'm struggling with anxiety. Now there is that element, right? There's always a spiritual element to our reality, and so that needs to be looked at as well. But to simply say you don't trust God enough, or you need to let the joy of the gospel penetrate more deeply, it can be really condemning for people, for some people who really profoundly struggle in these areas and have tried so sincerely to bring this before God and to ask for healing and don't seem to be finding that, and it can be so distressing, and then added shame and distress when it's seen as kind of a failure of faith. So I just think it's so important just to say that this experience with mental illness is not a sin, and it's not a failure of faith. That God loves us in this place as well, and
I've never heard it put that way. Just to be able to name it is powerful. That just depression is not a sin. And we've been talking about how growing from self-knowledge to self-acceptance. And so people are becoming more knowledgeable about depression and anxiety today. And the ability to accept yourself in that, because you know that the Lord accepts you in your state of depression, anxiety. And that it's okay. He wants to meet you in that and bring you to a place of self-possession in which you're able to make a gift of yourself.
And I think that's something that needs to be said more by leaders in the church, because there can be this kind of stigma around mental illness, especially among Christians. It's almost a little bit kind of more so the stigma for believers. And there's so much, so much. There's a lot of science that is pointing to biological influences, and so that's not to be discounted. We are a psychosomatic unity, as the monks like to say when I was in seminary, meaning that our body and our soul are united. We're not a soul riding our body like a motorcycle. We're integrated. We're united, and so just like a developmental disorder has an impact on the way in which the consciousness is experienced and our intellectual capacity or capacity for freedom. There's some very obvious examples of how the structure and functioning of the brain or of the body can impact our psychological, our mental, our spiritual lives. A very, very similar way for a lot of depression and anxiety. There's an increasing body of research that is showing the the physical impact of on these diagnoses. So just to name that again, right? That again, it's not a failure to need antidepressants. Antidepressants can be very helpful for a lot of people, and can address some of the neurochemical imbalance in the brain. So there's a lot of research in that area. It's still a very kind of open area. So there's, nothing's kind of there's still so much more to be learned. But to name that as well, that it's not a sin to need some psychotropic medication, whether it's antidepressant or other kind. Right? It's not a failure. It's not like I wish I could just sort of pull myself up by my bootstraps and get through this. No, that can actually be really helpful and a result of a physical condition. And so just to name that and be open to that is really important. And then to look at what are some of the other factors that might be present in my life? And a lot of research is drawing some connections between relationships and depression. And an authentic experience of intimacy in the sense of like a healthy, emotional, like being known and knowing the other. Those relationships of depth and of meaning. That a lack of those in someone's life can be a factor. And our culture is not very good at deep relationships. And so that's I think something that the church in particular can really focus on in terms of reaching out and helping those that might struggle with depression is to offer meaningful relationship, offer a relationship of listening. A lot of people who experience depression further isolate because they have a sense that others don't want to be around them when they're feeling low, right? And so to be willing to be with somebody when they're low and not need to fix them, and not be a kind of a cheerleader or a drill sergeant, just to be with in a low moment is such a gift for a lot of people that don't often experience that. And I think that's very much part of our vocation as Christians, to be with people in their circumstances, whether it's physical poverty or other physical ailments or mental struggles as well. I think it's very much a part of our mission. And a lot of similar things could be said about anxiety.
Father Bryan, often when I think of depression, it's not necessarily the state of depression, but just often the depressing feelings that I can get from a failure in the development of virtue in my life. Can you speak about some advice you have in dealing with that?
I appreciate the question there. It's such a delicate kind of balance in the pursuit of virtue and growing in discipline, where it's helpful to have a high ideal and to strive for that ideal, and then when we fall short, which of course we always we will never be perfect in this life. It's hard to face that. It's hard to accept that, and it can be quite disappointing and discouraging. I was listening to a Christian author that I really appreciate recently, and he was talking a little bit about this, about how when we look at our lives, it's often, especially for people who are serious about their faith and wanting to draw closer to Jesus and grow in holiness. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. We look at our lives, and the first thing we notice are failures. It's like just the most kind of prominent thing on our awareness is where we are falling short. And that fixation on failure can certainly contribute to depressive feelings and to the state of discouragement even and feelings even of hopelessness or despair. And so while holding on to the ideal and acknowledging that we're not there yet, and this is what we want to move towards and that we're striving for, this author was talking about another kind of discipline, which I thought was a really striking invitation. And he called it the discipline of celebration.
Mm.
Now, I struggle with the virtues and discipline generally, so I thought, well, discipline of celebration, this is something that I can get behind. I like to celebrate. And his point was to focus, to have an honest assessment of ourselves. And that honest assessment includes having some joy in where we've come from, in the progress that we have seen, having some joy in witnessing Jesus' presence already in our lives, and that impact that he's having. And so, yeah, to have that, it's not, it's a fuller picture. We tend to kind of narrow our gaze and focus on our faults, our failings, our weaknesses, and again, sometimes the language of some in the church can focus on that, and without letting go of that, it's sort of opening up the lens, so to speak, to also see the good and see to take joy and to delight in what God is already working in our lives, and it's there. It's absolutely there for each of us. It's so valuable.
Yeah, I often think there can be a misguided attempt at humility in which we want to think poorly of ourselves or degrade ourselves and overly focus on our failures. But we know that humility is living in the truth.
Exactly.
And so when you're living in the truth, you should be able to celebrate and rejoice in the good that is happening and in the blessings that God is bringing about in your life. So that positive approach is a humble approach in some way.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a false idea of humility that I sort of must always kind of be beating myself up and down on myself, because humility is truth. Yeah, absolutely. And again, sometimes it helps to have somebody journey with us who can help us. You know, I was talking myself with a spiritual director a little while ago, and he kept coming back to this point of the narrow gaze on myself is not how God sees me, and that His gaze is so much bigger. And so humility and celebrating the positives, you know, looking for the progress already made and looking for those victories, is seeing ourselves as God sees us, in that kind of more entire, more holistic vision.
As we explore this area of self-knowledge, we've been speaking about depression and anxiety, but how about anger?
Oh yes, anger. There's so much that could be said there. I think that, well, it's interesting that in some theories of some psychological theories make draw a very strong connection between depression and aggression. Is kind of the psychological term that's often used, and that for many, depression involves a lot of self-condemnation, self-recrimination, very negative self-talk is an example of that. And so it's almost like an aggression towards oneself and expressing anger towards oneself. And so some psychologists talk about some healing in the area of depression can involve the ability to appropriately express anger or even aggressive feelings to another person. That for many of us, we can kind of short circuit that. We're uncomfortable, or it's not safe, or maybe it wasn't safe for us growing up to be angry or to appropriately stand up for ourselves. And so our tendency is to avoid conflict kind of shut down when somebody's saying something that's hurtful to us or being disrespectful to us or even worse. We can have a tendency to allow a lot of very negative behavior towards us, and then but still feel that anger and that aggression. And so the theory is that kind of turns inward. It's an interesting theory. I think there's lots that could be said about that, but I think there's a spiritual parallel, or there's certainly it opens up a category for really important discussion at the spiritual level. So let's say we model our lives after Christ. Right? As Christians, that is the ideal. Jesus is the ideal. Well, Jesus experienced anger and expressed that anger towards others, and was able to do so even in situations that were threatening, that were not safe. Jesus is also meek, and he's also kind and respectful and loving. And so there's this tension even in the example of Christ that holds the ideal of meekness, but also the ideal of appropriately expressed just anger, righteous anger as a response to injustice, as the Catechism says, St. Thomas says. And so, for our own kind of growth in virtue, growth in healing, what is our relationship with anger is a great question. And do I notice in myself a tendency to avoid conflict, to avoid difficult conversations or crucial conversations, as they say in the missionary world? A classmate of mine who came from a missionary background, they would shorten it from crucial conversation, which is that famous book, to crew-con. It's like time for a crew-con. The ability to sit down and have a difficult conversation. And again, there's a virtuous way of expressing anger, and that's where the intention is not a reaction on my part. It's kind of defensive and reactive and just sort of exploding out. And a lot of people have been very hurt by poorly expressed anger, misuse of aggression, misuse of our strength. Right? I mean, so much of the state of the world, there's so much hurt out there precisely because of misused power and a lack of virtuous expression of anger or aggression or power. But the solution is not to close it off or break it off. It's how do I do this in a healthy way? How do I express this for the good of the other, and not simply as a reaction, reactivity? And so I think one of the areas that people experience this most keenly is in family, or in relationships that are very very close. And I think we can all think of examples where there's somebody in our life that might act in a certain way or do something that we find very hurtful, but we find ourselves unable or unwilling to speak up. And so it can be really challenging, but I think part of our growth in virtue and in healing, becoming whole, is the ability to say, I just want you to know, when you said this, that was very hurtful to me. It's not attacking. It's not reactive. It's staying in my experience, but there is a kind of aggression. There is a righteous anger. Or you see somebody else hurt by something that somebody has said or done. And to be able to step up and say, it's really important for me to tell you how your behavior is impacting me or impacting this other person.
Yeah.
Whether it's received well or not, to be able to do that well. That's such a sign of maturity and and growth, and so related to so many other areas. So much more that could be said. I mean,
yeah. No, it's interesting when you present it with Christ as the model. He's fully man, fully mature, and so he gives us permission in a way to appropriately express anger. And so we should be inspired by his witness to be aware when we feel those times of anger, but then, as you say, the ability to express it to someone, to let them know, because that's true love. That's like tough love, to have those crucial conversations, the crucons. Jesus engaged in crucial conversations frequently, and he is the model for us. And so we need to pray for that grace constantly when we sense that resistance, to make that next step, to actually reach out to that person in love, to appropriately express anger.
So true. I'm aware, I'm kind of holding attention in my mind, also aware of how anger and aggression is so often misused, and that a lot of us have been very hurt by a kind of unrestrained expression of anger. And so just, want to kind of qualify what we've been talking about, that this is not an invitation to kind of a wild expression of anger without thought or without concern for the other. That's very much not how Jesus operates, and not what we're talking about here. But that the opposite extreme is also in some ways sinful. Just as a hurtful expression of anger is sinful, so too this inability or unwillingness to express, to have a crucial conversation. One could say that is also sinful, because it's like Aristotle talks about virtue being in the middle, the mean between two extremes. We're looking for that mean, the virtuous middle way that avoids the pitfalls of either extreme when dealing with anger.
Yeah, well said. We often think of sins of commission, but sins of omission are so easy for us not to be aware of. And so this could be a good examination of conscience for us as well. Just to close on a lighter note, it's quite ironic that I'm here as a transitional deacon, and a decade ago, Father Bryan was also here as a transitional deacon.
I don't like it called a decade. That really puts it in context.
Long time ago. Ancient of days. So, Father Bryan, what would be one of your most memorable moments here serving as a deacon at Corpus Christi?
Sure. Yeah, well, it was quite an experience that summer. Father Michael Conahan, many will remember, was retiring as pastor, and Father Hamilton coming in. So it was a lot of lessons learned in that transition. And the one experience stands out. I remember as a seminarian hearing priests prepare for weddings in their parishes, and sometimes being what I thought was like a little bit particular, a little kind of stickler for a lot of details. And I remember thinking, like, come on, Father, like, could we be, this is their day, like, could we be a little more kind of accommodating and celebratory? And I learned here at Corpus Christi the reason why. Pastors have experienced a lot.
Okay.
And
do tell.
So we had this one wedding, beautiful wedding. So I don't mean to criticize it all. It was really, really lovely wedding. And they had decorated the church extensively. It was really lovely. And they had these really tall vases for flowers, filled with like a rose-colored water. So it was like this pink water. And so they're maybe 2 or 3 feet tall vases, as I recall. And they stood on a pedestal that was itself another 3 or 4 feet tall. And they were down the aisle, kind of alternating pews.
Okay.
It looked stunning.
Wow.
And so quite dramatic as the couple came in, or the bridal procession, and all went well until the recessional at the end, when the couple were presented, and everyone kind of applauded, and then they're leaving the church together, walking down the aisle, and the videographer was in front of them, walking backwards, filming. And he bumped one of the pedestals, and the vase fell off the pedestal, hit the hard floor, and it just shattered. This loud bang, crash, shattered. And a woman was so startled, she screamed. So you hear the crash, and then a scream, and the scream startled others, who then knocked other pedestals.
No.
So there were 3 or 4 vases that, in quick succession, shattered as the couple were walking out. And then you have this wave of rose-colored water flowing down the center aisle. Oh my gosh, it was quite memorable. So when pastors say no flowers in the aisle, there's a reason.
Okay.
They have experience.
Good advice. Well received. I'll remember that for a long time. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Father Bryan.
My pleasure.
Time with you.
Yeah,
it's a pleasure to be with you, learn from you at this time, and to spend this summer with you. So I hope all the YouTubers out there and the Corpus Christi Parish enjoyed this episode with Father Bryan, and God bless.
God bless.